So now that you have some nice patterns that you can work with, it's time to start a file and draw some elevations for your drawings. And there's a couple of different ways that you can do this, but the easiest way is to zoom out and create a new artboard. So first of all, I'm going to fit the drawing here on my screen so that I can see what I've got. And then I'm going to open up this Artboards palette. And what you'll see here, this is basically an artboard is a sheet of blank paper that are collected into a single file. And I can just click the new artboard button. And what it will do, I'm just going to zoom out a little, it creates a copy of your current artboard. And these can be edited, by the way. You can double click on it and it brings up the adjustment tool here. Let me just get this out of the way. The artboard tool where you can change the numerical value here. So for example, if I wanted it to be 17 inches by 11, which is a tabloid size, you'll see that the size of the artboard changes. And you can also, in addition to double clicking on it there, you can use the artboard tool, and that also allows you to kind of graphically change the size of the artboard. So I'm going to stretch this guy out to be roughly a tabloid size. And once you have that, you can start to draw your interior elevation to show how you're going to use this cool textile that you've created. And there's a few things that you can do to help yourself out doing that. First of all, let's turn on the grid. The grid is like many tools that we have. It's a reference grid that allows you to draw. However, we tend to draw to scale as interior designers. So let's set the preferences for that grid. The way you do that is you go to Illustrator, choose Preferences, and then Grid and Guides, or Guides and Grid. Under a PC, I believe that is under the Edit pull-down menu, where all these different preference settings are. And here are the grid settings. And basically, you can set this up any way you want, but I like them every inch. And then if I'm in, say, 1/4 inch scale, which is probably a good scale for our drawings, I'll make a grid line every 4 inches. So that means that there'll be a little gray grid line every foot, because 1/4 inch equals a foot in 1/4 inch scale. And what you'll see is we have a nice grid here. And I could absolutely snap to this grid if I wanted to. But I don't usually like to snap to the grid. At this stage of design, I like it to be a little more open. And the other thing I like to do is bring in a scale figure. So I'm going to go to File, Place, and Browse. And I have a couple of ready-made scale figures here. Here's a guy. These scale figures, by the way, are PNG files, and those are files which have what's called an alpha channel. And that means that if there is an area of white in the drawing, it usually shows up as blank, which is to say invisible. So when I draw this guy here, when I place him in the model, you might say, well, how do I know how big it is? Well, this is where my handy-dandy grid comes in. Every one of these squares is a foot. So I can just stretch this guy down until he's, say about 6 feet tall. I guess it works even better if I've actually selected him. There we go. And now I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, he's a little on the short side. Let's help him grow up a little bit here. You can see here that it is easy enough to change the size. And then I'm going to, I'll show you, I also have another scale figure, just a silhouetted kind of figure. Same idea. And these figures there, it's entirely up to you as to whether or not you prefer the kind of silhouette person or you prefer the realistic looking person. So there are my objects, and there's a couple different ways, places that you could show your pattern. First of all, I could just draw, say, a rectangle. Again, I'm going to use my grid here as a reference, and I could snap to a grid, and I could make this, let's see, that's about 8 feet tall right there. And that's about, 16 feet long. So I could draw, say, a room wall, okay? And let me send this to the back. Just right-click on it, choose Arrange, and send to back. So once you have your object ready, or your wall ready, you can come in and paint it with your materials. Okay, and I'll just pick one of these patterns. Now, one of the tricks is one of the things to recognize is that your pattern as drawn is 12 inches tall, or 4 inches tall, whatever it was. Obviously, that's not the right scale for this interior elevation, but we also don't know exactly how big we want it to be. So to make the pattern scale differently, all you do, you select the rectangle that has the pattern on it, right-click on it, and from the Transform menu, there is an option for Scale. And choose that scale number, and here's the Scale menu. And there are a number of options. First of all, you can check the preview button down here. That will show you what it's going to look like. And let's say I opt for 20% of the original. Now, right now, you see how it's making the rectangle smaller? I actually just want to transform the pattern. So uncheck the box for transform the object. And then you change the pattern's dimension until you find one that is kind of looks like what you're expecting for this project. I actually somehow envision this pattern as being a lot more dotty, I guess, is the right term, the technical term. And so there you go. You can see that that could make a very interesting wallpaper. And I'll just click OK. And because this is an interior elevation, you can absolutely come in here and use some of our other tools. If you wanted to make the line a different quality, or you want to make it a heavier line weight, which tends to look pretty good on an interior elevation. You can also draw in a cut line just by using like the pen tool, for example. I'll just draw this line in. If you want to indicate that the interior elevation is actually just a partial interior elevation. Okay, so you see you can really have some nice controls here, and you could even come in and change the line quality of that. So there we go. There's my wall. Now, what if? Well, first of all, what if there's a wall base? You could come in here and draw in, a wall base just using the rectangle tool. And again, you're just experimenting, trying to decide what you want this to look like. For example, let's see, maybe the wall base has a lighter line weight and is just a kind of neutral gray color. Okay, and then maybe after that, you decide that you want to bring these fellows forward here. I'll just arrange and bring to front. Okay. So you can gussy up these things, and changing the drawing order of these different objects is something that you kind of spend a lot of time doing when you're kind of perfecting your drawing. So what if I want to show this pattern on a piece of furniture? Well, let me give myself a little room here, and I'm going to go and place a love seat that I found on the internet. I didn't feel like drawing one from scratch. And like we did with the scale figures, you'll want to stretch this image so that it is about the right height for a love seat. Typically the seat is about 18 inches off the ground, but I will sometimes just put it right next to the person there so that I get kind of the right scale and look to it. So once you have the love seat available, what we're going to do, we're actually going to draw the love seat using the basic drawing tools in Adobe Illustrator. So first of all, certain shapes are going to be really easy. Okay, like the bottom part of the love seat here is probably just going to be a rectangle. Okay, so I'll just come here and I'll draw a rectangle. That's easy enough. All right. Now, when you do that, obviously you might want to consider using a material that makes sense. Now, in this case, it does have the material on there that we used before, but the line weight's awfully optimistic. Let's go with about a 1 on the stroke. Let me zoom in on this a little bit so we can see a little bit more. Now, how are we going to draw some of the other things? Well, the feet are easy enough. You can just use the pen tool. And what's nice about the pen tool, first of all, you can be quite precise. I'm going to zoom in a little bit and decide whether or not these are tapered or not. Of course, you don't have to be super obsessive about the detail level, just because this is a kind of sketch. Now, the arms here can be drawn. One thing that you can do with the pen tool is if you click and drag instead of just clicking, what you'll see is that you can draw a combination of straight lines and curvy lines. Okay, now I'm kind of messing these up a little bit, but you can see here that I can also just click and it draws a straight line. Now, how do I fix this very poorly drawn arc? Well, this is where your direct selection tool comes in handy. I'll click the direct selection tool, and what you'll see are these little anchor points, and each of these anchor points has what's called a kind of Bezier adjuster, which you can click and drag the handles on that Bezier adjuster to kind of change the way the arc of the curve is formed. So you can kind of soften it out just a little bit. You can also select these anchor points and you can actually delete them or move them individually. So there is quite a lot of control. Like I'll just click the arrow key to adjust it ever so slightly, nudge it up and down. And of course I can always zoom in if I want to see a little bit more granularity there. And you can spend a lot of time kind of tweaking these different elements. Right. Now I'm going to draw this in elevation, so I don't need to draw the back of this couch, love seat, but I do want to mirror these objects here. And the way you do that, again, I've just drawn them. I'll just right click on them and choose Transform, Reflect. Now, what's nice is in the Reflect menu, whoops. So using the Select menu, Select button, I will select my two pieces, and I can right click on them, choose Transform, and Reflect. Okay, and when you do that and you click, instead of just clicking OK, if you click the Copy button, what you'll end up with is, you guessed it, a copy. And I can just drag it over, holding down Shift to make sure that it stays in parallel arrangement with the other object. Finally, I can draw these other objects. I'm going to have to do some fancy footwork to get these cushions, though. And I'll show you some techniques that can work for that. I'll start by just drawing a couple of rectangles here. And we'll draw one for the back. Okay. Make sure that these are aligned with each other. Okay, and of course, because I'm drawing an elevation, if there's any other tweaking that needs to happen, if these need to stretch out, for example, absolutely go ahead and do that. All right, so how am I going to make these cushions more, I don't know, shall we say cushiony? Well, let's start with this guy here. I'm going to just make a copy down here below so that we can see it a little more clearly without the couch in the way. There are a lot of tools that allow you to modify these shapes. They're all under the Warp menu. I'm not really sure which one I'm going to need, but let's try the fisheye one, or maybe inflate. Let's see. When you choose these, what you end up with is a menu that will show you what the shape looks like after you've applied this particular effect. I don't really like that one. I think the fisheye one is going to work a little bit better. Okay, try that. Nah, that one's not working either. Let's try this bulge one. And if you look at the icon, it really tells you, and I'll zoom in on that so you can see it, it kind of indicates what's going to happen to a rectilinear shape when you use that tool. Okay? And now, what you can see, you can start to change how much it kind of bulges. And you can change whether or not the bulginess happens horizontally or vertically. Okay? So if I change vertical, I'll just move this back to 0. And then I tweak this ever so slightly. Let's end it down. Maybe let's make this 0. And let's tweak this down a little bit. You can see that I'm starting to get something that looks vaguely like the cushions. Okay. Click OK. And what's interesting about these effects, by the way, is that if you come over here to the appearance palette, these effects are elements that can be turned on and off. If I just click this option, it turns it on and off. Okay, so if you decide that you don't like the way something looks, you can always change it. So let me drag this on top here, and now you can see, oh, except sometimes it gets a little confusing which one is on top because these have a transparency to them. Let me just move this to the front. Okay, whoops. Drag this guy up, and then I'll move it, I'll move it into place on top of my couch here. And again, I just have the couch here for reference. And then what about this guy here? How are we going to create some kind of warping effect that makes that look correct? I'm just going to select that, and let's try warp, and oh, I don't know. Let's take a look at maybe shell. Shell is a good one sometimes. And again, if you look at the icon, you can get a sense of which ones are going to be working for you. The trick is here, you see how it's arcing up? Well, we can actually bend it down pretty easily. You can also kind of fiddle with how much it goes horizontally, kind of asymmetrically, okay, just to get a feel for how you like the way it looks. That looks pretty good for now. You click OK. And again, we're not aiming for something which is perfect. We're just aiming for something which is pretty close to kind of show off our materials. All right. Now, the last thing is each of these shapes, you might need some tweaking in order to kind of make the overlaps work so that you can see the couch beyond and you don't end up seeing too much of the floor. Okay. All right, so let me arrange this, send this to the front. Okay. Now, when I remove the couch image from behind this, what you'll see is you start to get a sense of what this is going to look like. Okay. And again, like I mentioned, some of these are not solid, so you do have a problem in that the cushions, for example, you're seeing a lot of overlaps. But basically, this starts to give you a pretty good sense of what the object is like. Now, lastly, let's make a copy of these cushions here. Again, I'll just hold down Alt. I'm not even going to bother with the mirror command. Okay, Alt. Now, so we have a pretty good sense of what the couch is going to look like. We could probably draw in the back of the couch that we would see here. And then that will lead to my next topic of discussion. Again, I'm going to arrange that and send it to the back. Now, you might say, well, this is very annoying because I can see through the pattern. Well, the patterns that we created, everybody's created something different. But when you have a pattern that has some transparency, there's a couple ways that you can alleviate this problem. Especially in this case where we don't want to see through the pattern. Okay, what you do, you call up your swatches menu and double click on the pattern that you're using. Okay, and it brings up our pattern editor that we have seen before. Now the trick is we basically want to add white to the background here in order to kind of hide the solid elements of these drawings. However, when I come in here and I draw a, well, I'll just make it a 4 by 4 rectangle, I suppose. When I draw that solid white box in there, first of all, it hides everything. That's not so good. And we don't need the stroke, so we'll just make the stroke invisible. So first of all, let's select the rectangle and send it to the back. So arrange, send to back. Right. And this is just one way that you can kind of get rid of this problem. When you do that, you can see that I now have cropped my pattern here because the white area blocks it out. Okay, there are the easiest way to fix that problem is to copy these elements over. Okay, so I'll just right-click on this and choose Transform, Move, or Shift Command M, and I'll move this over 4 inches. Okay, and make a copy, and the copy always goes on top. Okay, same with this guy. Oops, this guy is on the other side, so I'm going to have to Command Shift M. Oops, not new. Command Shift M, just a spelling error there. And I'll copy this guy over -4 inches. Okay. And then this last guy I'm going to copy. Now, interestingly enough, I want that to be 0 inches, but negative, going down on your screen is actually a positive number. I don't know why that is. Okay. So that is absolutely an easy way to kind of add solidity to your pattern. I'll just click Done. So what do you do when you have a pattern which has a lot of transparency in it? This is a pattern I created by drawing some squiggly lines and applying a watercolor brush to it. And first of all, look what happened to those squiggly lines. They're no longer individual paths with a pen applied to them. They're now these filled areas. So it gets a little complicated, especially if you wanted to add some kind of element to this particular drawing. Let me deselect everything, and if I wanted to draw, I don't know, just a circle here, I'll draw one up here. Oops. I'll draw one up here out of the way. What you'll see is that any circle that I draw, let me make this something we can recognize, like blue, it handles the transparency of the different layers quite differently. What's happening is that this line, or this path, is repeating on this side. So anywhere you see those repeats, you're going to get some of these unusual effects. So to make this particular pattern work with this shape, I want the shape to show up in front. You can't arrange it and bring it to the front. It won't go on the front because of this repeat pattern. There's a couple things you could do. You could change how the repeat pattern overlaps. So if I have the right in front as opposed to the left in front, sometimes that helps. I could also choose the bottom in front instead of the top in front. In this case, neither of those is going to work. What I need to do is do something a little more complicated. It's called creating a clipping mask. So what you'll do, create a rectangle. I'll just click once to anchor this rectangle right here, make it exactly the size of my pattern, which was 4 inches. And again, that's why I use 4 by 4, because it's easy enough to remember. Okay. And if you have any trouble getting it into exactly the right position, it does help to zoom in sometimes. Usually, Illustrator wants it to align with the background. Anyway, I'm going to arrange this so that it is in front, which seems counterintuitive. It doesn't actually matter what color it is. Now I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to do Command-Alt, Command-A, or Control-A on a PC to select everything. And now what I have my box, and I have all these weird shapes. What I'm going to do, I'm going to create a mask using this box so that it clips away all of the stuff outside of the box. And really the way you do that is pretty easy. You just go to Object, Clipping Mask, Make. And what you'll see is it has trimmed away all of these extra elements. So now I don't have the overlap that I had before. Okay? And again, like we did before, I could add in another rectangle that is solid if I want to avoid this problem. Anyway, that's just another way to deal with transparency in your patterns. Click done here, although I don't actually think I like the big bubble in there. Anyway, now I have my couch. I've grouped it. Or I think I grouped it. Let me see. I'll select it and I'll right click on it. And yep, I guess I grouped it. Once you've made the couch, zoom in on it. By the way, when you use Command plus or Control plus to zoom in and out, it zooms in and out around whatever object you've selected. So anyway, here, when you have a pattern on fabric, first of all, we can use the same scale tool that we used before, not transform the object, but transform the pattern. Of course, that's a little dottier than I was thinking here, maybe 20%. You would experiment with it to find exactly the right location for it and size. But also, sometimes you want to center a pattern on an object. To do that, you have to stop editing the whole group, but edit individual pieces. So I'm going to double click on this, and it now enters the group. And what you'll see this little exit isolation mode button appear. Isolation mode basically is telling you you're editing the group. Now I can select individual objects, and if I zoom in on that, and let's say I want to move my polka dots over a little bit so that they're not quite all in the corner, I can just use the Transform Move tool, and I can add it, I don't know, 0.05, and let's not change the vertical arrangement at all. Okay, and what you'll see, obviously you have to look at it, but now my polka dots are kind of centered. Again, I'm just kind of making a very general type of sketch here, but you can see that if you had a pattern that was very symmetrical and linear, you could center it in the couch fabric if you wanted to. Okay. So anyway, when you're done editing individual pieces, obviously you'd have to do each one on its own. You can either click outside of it, or you could click the exit isolation mode. And now my couch can be dragged right over here. Okay. There are a few other things that you could do to the couch to kind of, improve the look of it. Again, if I use my editing tool to edit pieces of it, I could add in a few things. Let me select a bunch of these, and there's a few effects that are kind of nice. These are, of course, gilding the lily. The one that I like is the drop shadow. I think everybody likes a drop shadow. This will not work on transparent materials, by the way. So absolutely make sure that your material has solidity if you want to use the drop shadow. And you can control a number of features, how dark the shadow is. Okay, if you change that, it changes. You can also change how far out the shadow itself goes. You'll have to just experiment, whoops, that's the same number, with what looks good in your drawing, and perhaps some pieces will look better than others. Okay, and the blurriness, the less blurry, the kind of more dense it is. Here, I'll double this number to 0.08. Okay, and you see how it just gets a lot softer there. Maybe that's okay up here, but maybe that's not so good down there. I think 0.04 looked pretty good. Click OK. And you can apply that to individual elements or the whole kit and caboodle. Again, you just want to make sure that things overlap in such a way that they look the way you anticipate. So I might try to get a shadow under this on top of this, and I like having a shadow on these little feet because they're typically recessed. Okay. Anyway, and then I'll exit my isolation mode, and now you can see we're starting to have a couch that is looking like it's part of the space. All right. And what's interesting to me is that you can have these patterns at different scales, right, all in the same drawing. To me, that's a lot of fun because it starts to talk about different ways that the pattern could be used. Now that I look at it, I don't think I'd want the pattern on the feet, but anyway, that's a mind. So what if the object you want to create has a lot more curves to it, something like a beanbag, which is obviously kind of blob-shaped. Well, now we can't just use those fun warp tools that we used before. What we need to do first is convert this vector drawing into a raster drawing. And essentially that's kind of like converting it to a Photoshop type of drawing, converting it to a picture. What you do is select the object, go to the object menu, and there's an option for Rasterize. Okay, and when you do that, let's drag that menu over here. There's a number of ways that it can be converted. Okay, you can use high resolution, screen resolution. I want to use a higher resolution, 600 pixels per inch. That's what PPI stands for. Because I think it would be just a little too dotty, a little too pixelated if I didn't use that high resolution. Anyway, and then you can choose a transparent background. Okay, there are other things that you can do, including creating a clipping mask. I'm not going to do that right away, and you'll see why. So here it is. Here's my image, and if you do zoom in on it, you'll see that the pattern is actually dottier. And if it is really too dotty, you can up the resolution that you export at. But now, when we use our effects, I'm going to come in here and use the warp fisheye tool. I think that's probably going to look the best. Now we can really get some interesting effects. All right, you see how it's going to start to look all bulgy. All right, and I could obviously use the bulge tool, and I can warp this guy. And you start to get some irregular line weights. Okay, and again, this is because this is an image. I can't come back and sort of double click on it or use my direct selection tool and edit those lines. I'm stuck with what I've got. Also, this object, if you do some other effects, they don't always work. Let's try the drop shadow. Okay, let me preview what it's going to look like. It doesn't always work if there's transparency in here. And, of course, it has to look right with the object. In this case, I'm not so sure I want a shadow off of the X side. Okay, but maybe just below it and maybe just a little bit. All right. Oop. Right, so let's make this a little smaller also. All right. And that looks a little more normal to me. Now, if you are, and this we can, oops. Anyway, once you've got a drop shadow on there, the last thing you could do, if you absolutely want to get back the lines so that you can manipulate them, create I don't know, different line types. Sometimes they get warped beyond recognition. You can come in and draw a new clipping mask. I'll just draw one that's more or less the outline of what we've got here. Again, like I mentioned, once you convert it to a raster image, you don't have the ability to come in and make changes anymore. So sometimes it's nice to be able to get those back. Anyway, I'm going to use the selection tool to select the line I just drew, the path I just drew. And I'll make it a black line. It doesn't really matter what the fill color is because I'm going to use it as a clipping mask. You just select the two objects, right-click on them, and choose Make Clipping Mask. I could also get that from the Object pull-down menu. And what it will do, it will crop the image, and you can come back in here and you can grab the path and change the line weight and apply brushes and all that kind of good stuff. Okay, so either way, I think in this case I actually am just fine with the way it looks as an image. Okay, and now we can just drag this guy over, whoops, to our space. All right, and we'll start to build up a nice little project here. And let's move these guys forward again. Arrange. Whoops, arrange, bring to front. Okay, so you can see you can really get some interesting effects. And if I decide, for example, that I just don't like, I don't know, the shadow on this particular beanbag, I can come in here if I can grab that thing and drag it. Drag these guys out of the way. I could also draw in a shadow using lines. I'll just draw a shadow here. And I could make that line a line type. Here, let's just use one of the standard ones. This guy's usually pretty good. Okay, and we'll make it black. All right, and maybe a smaller stroke. And I'll nudge that guy up and take away the fill pattern. Okay, and you see how that creates a little bit of a shadow on the bottom of my beanbag. And that's just a different way. And you can even draw little shadows to create folds and things like that. So quite a few different options, but the goal here is to show how your fabric would be used in different. One last fun thing that you can do to your drawings to, I don't know, give them a little sense of realism. Again, we're just trying to see how your materials are going to work in reality. And in reality, we have electric lighting, but of course we don't really have lighting in this program, but we can kind of fake it. What I've done, I drew a little triangle that is supposed to look like one of those cones of light, and you see those sometimes in drawings. And there is actually a material. I'm just going to go to the swatches here, and under gradients, there are what are called fades. And what these do, I'll call up the menu, these fade generally from one color to either black, or white, or red. They fade to transparent. So I'm going to choose this one here. And you see how it's white on one side and then it's basically transparent on the other side. And let me close this. And gradients like this, there's a whole gradients menu or palette. Click on the gradients palette. And with this object selected, I can actually just change the angle of the gradient. And I can stretch it out as I see fit. I can also make the stroke transparent. Okay, so it starts to look kind of like a cone of light. And then the last thing you can do, I'm going to try. Let's try blurring this. Give it a little bit of softness. Drag my blur menu in here. And maybe a nice good blur will make it look kind of like lighting. Okay, so obviously this is just a stylistic thing. It's not really lighting, and who knows what we really have. But sometimes that is a touch that can make the drawing really come to life. I'm going to call up my move menu, and let's see, we'll copy it over half an inch. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, and or maybe 0.6 or something like that, and we'll make a copy. And when you do that, if you do Command D or Control D, it will make another copy exactly the same distance away. And you can see now I've got a space that kind of looks, you know, all right, it doesn't really look like it's lit, but it looks pretty close. Certainly it suggests what we're planning for this space. And there you go. That is one last thing. I didn't do it on top of my pattern because my pattern, there's so much white that you wouldn't really notice it very much. I suppose I could draw an inverted cone and draw it gray or black. And that is basically it. Don't forget to save your document so that you can start putting together your final board, which will be on a separate video.